Greetings, this presentation covers Epicor Eclipse ERP vendor maintenance. Vendor maintenance and customer maintenance are very similar, so if you've learned one, you're 80% of the way towards learning the other one, with a couple of little minor differences, of course. Both are part of the entity file in the universe database, so this is some explanation of the similarities, and when you're running reports, you also have to keep in mind that you're running against the entity file and you have to filter for customer or vendor. Vendor records can be created either from the Solar main menu or from within purchase order entry. They'll both get you to the same screens. There's no limitations like there is doing a COD customer and sales order entry. When you create a new record, keep in mind that the name should be 35 characters max. Try not to put commas, quotes, or single quotes into the name if at all possible, because if you do reports, that could kind of foul things up a little bit when you export them as CSV files. The entering in the address information is going to behave the same as in customer maintenance. You're going to put in the address as soon as you get to city, it's going to pop up a drop down for the zip code. It doesn't allow you to freeform enter it. So if the zip code doesn't exist, now you're going to have to go into zip code maintenance and add it. So keep that in mind. But it's pretty rare when you don't come across a zip code. The sort by is going to be maximum 12 characters. It typically auto-fills in with the first 12 characters of the name. This changes the sort order if you had a vendor, one pay to, several connected ship tos, and you wanted to change the sort order of the listing of ship tos. That's what you use the sort by for, is to change that around. The index is additional search criteria. As mentioned before in customer maintenance, the Eclipse search engine has a little trouble when you have letters spaced out like ABC Incorporated. Things like that might be difficult to find, so you might want to change the index around to something a little more searchable, as you see in the example. Normally the AR phone contacts are put in place in the record, and that's because your AP people are really going to be the only ones that are going to be in vendor maintenance looking at this stuff. For the contacts for doing purchasing, you're going to create contacts for those. Create as many contact records as are necessary for this particular vendor. Typically these are going to be your vendor inside sales reps, your regional sales manager that you may have to contact for disputes, things like that. Putting them in the contact maintenance allows them to be accessible for all of your Eclipse employees, not just the people that only have access to viewing and maintaining the vendor maintenance records. On the www tab, you may want to enter in the vendor's website, although this is optional. It doesn't really serve a particular use. And the most important part is for the AP people to put the AR company contact email address in here, because that'll auto-populate when they go to do communications with the AR of this vendor. Now looking at the vendor type area, and keep in mind that Eclipse for some strange reason saw necessary to create two regions called vendor type. This window with the arrows that you see here intimately controls the behavior of the record. The other field entry, which we'll get into it later, is just for reporting purposes as far as I know. For most vendors, the pay to, where the check goes, and the ship from, where the order goes, and when they're shipped from, are going to be the same place. So you're going to have normally one record with both of those checked. But there are cases where there might be a corporate office where they want all the remit to payments sent to, but there might be a local regional distribution warehouse that they're pulling from. So keep that in mind. As with the customer records, any one vendor is only going to have one pay to, but they could have many ship froms, and the ship froms point to the pay to. Here's a common arrangement that you may come across if you're dealing with a vendor that's part of a buying group. And here we have the two records. We have the ship from for Intermatic Incorporated, which we're actually sending the orders to, and they're we're actually receiving the product from. But since Intermatic's part of the AD buying group, when we go to actually cut the checks to pay for it, we're writing the checks over to AD. So that's why we have the pay to is this Intermatic care of AD and the AD address, and the Intermatic ship from is completely different record. And as you can see, they're tied together by looking at the pay to field that's entered in on the ship from record. Here's an example of the vendor type for a freight vendor, and this particular vendor provides freight only. It doesn't actually manufacture anything. So of course we've got the freight vendor marked. According to the big book, a freight vendor has also got to be a pay to and a ship from, which makes perfectly good sense, or else it cannot be selected in the purchase order entry for freight. And here you see in the purchase order entry example that I've put in place, we have selected our freight company and added the freight charge into the purchase order. And our final two vendor types are auto delete and manufacturer. The auto delete flag is used when you've got a vendor that you don't want to use anymore and you eventually want to purge the record from the system. And this will not delete the record automatically. This just puts a flag on it, and if you run the purge process at some point and there aren't any transactions still pending to complete, then the system will purge the record out. Typically, it's not a good idea to purge records. Typically, you just want to hide them from the search list, set them for no order entry, but keep them there for historical purposes. So the auto delete you normally check as part of the hiding the record and no longer using it from the system, but you don't really ever run the purge process to delete the record. And manufacturer flag, that's of course set for if this particular vendor also manufactures. And I don't really know all the implications, but I suspect that if you've got a buying group vendor and you set that, you might cause some issues. So don't do that. Normally the manufacturer flag is not set. The ship via field is used to define the default shipping method that the vendor should use, and normally this is left blank because it's usually up to the vendor to decide how they want to ship to you rather than you request how you want it to be sent. And of course, since this is a default, when you're generating the purchase order you can override it and change it to something else as necessary, but typically, as I said, it's left blank. Here is our second vendor type entry, and as I said, this does not seem to affect the operational logic of the record in the system. This seems to be just a simple flag for reporting purposes. Can be handy, so use it, but it won't damage anything if you leave it blank. If you need to customize the vendor type list, this of course is done under Control Record Maintenance, where most things are done in Eclipse, and you can just add to or delete from the list as needed. The overshort controls allow the AP department to process an invoice even if it doesn't reconcile exactly to what the purchase order estimate originally was. And this is fairly common. It's a rare day when you get something that reconciles to the penny. If you didn't have these wiggle room controls in place, then it would have to reconcile to the penny, or else the AP department couldn't process. They'd have to put it in the disputed queue, and the next level management would have to go and review every blasted thing, even for a few cents or a few dollars, and approve it before the AP could cut the check. So to avoid this and speed up the process, if it's just a few dollars, now they can go ahead and do it without the intervention of management. In this example here, this allows the payment, if it's over or short by 2% of the total invoice, to a maximum amount of $10, or whichever's first. The payment terms controls the default payment terms to the vendor. This, of course, can be overwritten and changed in the purchase order if necessary. This is just going to be what's automatically going to fill in unless otherwise directed. And in this example here, this is going to show in the acronyms that we use in our system. Allow 2% discount of the invoice if paid in full within 10 days, or the total is due in 25 days, or else there'll be additional charges. See your terms code maintenance presentation for more info on all the different terms that you may have in your system and how to set up new terms. Direct terms essentially do the same thing that payment terms do, except if you have a vendor that for some strange reason would have a different set of terms if they ship direct to the customer instead of if they send direct to you. This is a pretty rare thing. I'd say I've never seen it in my 12 years, but it's possible. Typically this is blank though, and blank usually in Eclipse means go to the defaults that are set in control maintenance. So this is what I'm showing here in the other window, is how to set the default payment terms in control maintenance. The freight setting allows or restricts whether freight charges can be entered on the purchase order or not, and typically the default is to allow. And in this system, of course, as we said, since it's blank, it goes to control maintenance, takes a look at whatever the defaults are set in the control maintenance. And of course, in the control maintenance, if you see that's blank, it also means allowed to. The back order days entry is usually used to pad the number of days that something put on back order is expected to receive. And there are 3 possible entries that you could be seeing in here. R would automatically put any items that are back ordered in the review queue to be handled. C automatically would cancel any back orders to this vendor, which would be a bad thing. And a number would be the number of days to pad to the receiving date. And here we see in our example we have a pad of 7 days from the receive date that we have set in the system. If it's blank, of course it's going to default to the control maintenance entry. And if that's blank as well, the system defaults to essentially padding 3 days. Primary currency is usually left blank. The system is going to assume that whatever currency you're using as default in your company, the vendor is also going to be using. But I guess if you're purchasing from a foreign country and they're not trading in US dollars, you'd change the currency here. Luckily, I've never come across that, and hopefully you don't either. The vendor order entry selection off the menu allows you to create some order entry messages. The display in the header screen in purchase order entry. The vendor instructions will print on the paperwork when you generate the PO. The internal notes only display on the screen in the header section. You actually have to go to the header tab to see them. But they don't get printed out, so you can put in there Fred's a Fink and he'll never see. The order entry message I find much more routinely used, and this creates a pop-up message that automatically displays as soon as the purchase order entry is created and that vendor is selected. You have to click close before you can go and type anything in the purchase order, so it confirms that someone has actually seen it, unless somehow they manage to click close while their eyes are closed. Anything's possible. And so this is pretty handy. Of course it does not print anywhere, so this is just for internal use. The reminder notes allow a great deal more control than just the simple order entry note in the previous slide. And this allows you to create messages that can be set to expire that will display in a variety of different places in the vendor maintenance and the sales order entry and the purchase order entry screens, and in certain cases in various tabs in certain parts of the steps of creating the purchase order. So very, very powerful. But since it is a little more complicated to set up, it's not used as often. The AP summary selection is just a convenience for anyone in the vendor maintenance record, ideally your AP people, to jump into the AP inquiry and take a look at the status of the account to the vendor. The additional vendor information screen allows for a plethora of obscure settings, most of which you will never have call to make use of. There are 2 that are occasionally used though. When you want to tombstone a vendor, that is quit doing purchase orders against them, The process here is to check the no order entry flag, check the exclude from index flag, and on the vendor type on the main screen, check auto delete. And you're not actually deleting the record here. You would theoretically if you ran the purge process, but I'm recommending not to run the purge process. What this is going to do is the record is still there for historical purposes, but for your ordinary users, they're not going to be able to see it in the search list. They won't be able to pick it to do purchase orders on, and so it's as good as being gone without being gone, just in case you need it again for some whatever reason. If you've purchased the Eclipse Document Imaging Companion product, then you're going to have access to this imaging section down here, and this is going to allow you to be able to attach documents that may be of some relevance for easy access for all of the AP people or management. Here we have an example of me attaching a PDF file that is meant to be a scan of our credit application to the vendor. So a handy thing to have. Once again, you have to have the Document Imaging Companion product in order for this to work. It works fairly simple. The Eclipse pretty much allows you to attach documents to just about any record in the system. But for more information on this, look for the presentation Attaching Images, Docs in Customer Maintenance. This is going to work the same in customer maintenance as it does in vendor maintenance, and this will give you all the details you need. The remaining slides cover the seldom and never used features that you have in vendor maintenance. Everything up to this point are settings that you would commonly use. The vendor part number selection allows you to create a listing of, well, it's a translation table to connect the products as you have them named in your system to the vendor's part number to show up on the purchase order. And this could be handy in some cases, but honestly I've never had an occasion to use it, because usually the vendor's part number is also going to be your catalog number, so it's usually close enough description wise that they can make it out without too much trouble. Here you see in the example purchase order entry what the end result is going to be if you do create a translation table. The Classify selection gives you access to the user-defined data area, and these are custom data fields that you may have created to add custom information to the vendor record. You can create the additional listing of inputs that you want to capture using the control maintenance. It's called Vendor Classification Sort List. Access list, I had to look this one up. The Big Book of Eclipse says that this is used for the Eclipse Salesforce Automation Companion product, of which I have never heard of, and therefore Eclipse is apparently not too terribly interested in trying to sell it to anyone, if they still support it. And this just allows you to restrict and control access to the record from the Salesforce Automation product. I honestly, they don't mention a whole lot about this. I don't know if it controls anything outside of Salesforce Automation. The Accessible Branches selection allows you to grant or restrict a branch from ordering from this vendor. This is handy if you've got vendor records and a vendor that may only supply in certain regions, so you make sure your purchasing person, one of your branches, doesn't goof and select the wrong thing. Vendor payment information is used to refine the payment processing and payment types the vendor will accept. And honestly, I haven't seen a vendor that will accept anything just short of kidneys. So this hasn't been ever used by me. Perhaps you have more finicky vendors. The Big Book of Eclipse mentioned that if you have this set for a generic vendor, then this record can be used for processing customer refunds. I'm not entirely sure of that process, but it sounds pretty cool. Sounds like you probably want to at least set up one vendor record that's a generic vendor for doing refunds, but up to you. Vendor volume rebates. This is used to send up vendor rebates that are based on purchasing volume in a certain span of time. And I have never had a vendor that did rebates on that particular criteria, so if you do, well, good luck. Additional address is definitely one of those head scratching of why is this in here, but there it is anyway. I suppose in certain cases their thinking was that you're going to have a vendor address that is so long that it won't even fit into the 2-line address entry field. And this is an enhancement to allow you to add an even longer address into that field. But of course in my system, and probably yours as well, as soon as you select this, it's going to bark at you that if your forms haven't been modified to accommodate this additional address information, it's going to get chopped off anyway. So I don't know, maybe there's 3 or 4 people in the world that are using this, but it's not something that you'd normally come across. The additional keyword selection provides another additional level for grouping and being able to search on a group of or a particular vendor just based on some additional keyword that you select. And never had occasion to use this. Normally the vendor name and the index is sufficient enough for searching criteria, but you know, it's one more additional thing to play with if you want to do something interesting with grouping. Expense distribution is another one of those what type of selections. This, according to the book, is used to spread the percentage of an invoice payment across several GL accounts. I can't imagine a case where this would be used, and as I'm understanding this correctly, you could say 20% of the invoice gets posted to this account, and another 70% of the invoice can be posted to this other account, and the remaining 10% can go to this third account. I don't know what the use of that would be, but there it is. Vendor notes seems kind of redundant considering all the other types of notes that you can create in the record, and these are, you can create your own free-form titles. I think the system allows you to produce up to 20 different note titles that you can just type in here. It only displays within the record. You have to select the vendor notes to even see the darn things. It's there. I don't know when you might have an occasion to use it. Usually all the other notes that you have are plenty sufficient. Branch overrides are used to override branch settings for order entry, message, or terms. And I don't like overrides. I don't like doing anything override if you want to. If you're creating a whole bunch of exceptions like I before Q, except after Z, only on Thursdays between 1 and 3, you're going to make management of your system much more insanely complicated, and when things go unpredictable, good luck trying to find out where you put the exception. But anyway, so here's an exception, don't use it. Activity triggers can be useful in other parts of the system, but not really in vendor activity. But what a trigger is it's usually used to automate an email notification or document sending, at least in the case of the vendor maintenance. Triggers can be used to trigger processes in the system when they're used in other places. Setting them up is fairly straightforward. There's a limited set of selections and triggers that you can create. And if you want more than that, you'll have to talk to Epicor to have some custom programming done. But they're very rarely used. I'm not really sure why that is. Anyway, so here's an example of a activity trigger set so that every time a purchase order is created, it automatically sends a copy of the purchase order to the person specified in this email. This is a, of course, foolish thing to do, but it's just there as an example. Normally, it's up to the purchasing agent to decide how he wants to send the PO and to who at the time of the creation. You wouldn't want to automate this ordinarily. But if you do, there it is. Drop point sets where the product is to be delivered regardless of what the purchasing branch is. This is another one of those override things I wouldn't suggest using, but it is in there, and so I have to show it to you. And luckily, that's the last one on our list. And this concludes our presentation on vendor maintenance. I hope that this information will provide use to you. And as always, thank you for your attention, and I am not Scott Zahn.